Well, when I was a child, my grandmother would often make me grilled cheese and tomato soup. It was one of my favorites. There was nothing more comforting than that delicious combination on a cold Midwestern day, sitting by the fireplace after having been out playing in the snow. In fact, I would often get so excited about tasting it that I would forget to test the soup's temperature before attempting to eat it. Of course, there's nothing worse than burning the top of your mouth while trying to eat piping hot soup. So one day, my grandmother taught me a trick. She said, instead of plunging your spoon deep into the soup, try skimming a little bit off from the top. The surface of the soup is always cooler, and therefore much more easier to eat. She was right, of course, and not just about soup. No, things in general are easier on the surface, which, if I'm honest, is probably the reason I prefer it. I'd much rather sit on the lake shore and enjoy its tranquility than jump off a boat into its dark depths, or run alongside the river and appreciate its power than wade out into its current and allow it to take me for a ride, or sit on the beach and look out at the horizon, then let the waves of the ocean bring me back to shore. I suspect I'm not alone. In fact, my guess is there's a whole generation that feels the same. After all, if you saw the movie Jaws as many times as I did as a child, you learn very quickly that the surface is a much more sensible place to be. In fact, I was watching a documentary recently on the creation of the first Jaws movie, in which Steven Spielberg was being interviewed about his rationale for how the movie was filmed. Apparently, his original intent was to show this giant shark eating as many people as possible on film. However, they had so many problems with this giant mechanical shark that they had to actually think of an alternative. And so Spielberg made the decision to film all the shark scenes on the surface of the water. Instead of relying on the scares to come from what the viewer sees, the real terror then comes from the viewer does not see. Turns out that a technological difficulty becomes a brilliant idea. Although in the end, the film simply reaffirmed what we already know to be true. That we're more afraid of the unknown than we are the already known. It's just safer to stay in the shallows than it is to dive into the depths. Isn't that your experience? It's certainly mine. It's easier to spend time on the shining exterior of our surface than to navigate the depths of our true selves. It's easier to criticize each other from a distance on social media than take the time to hear one another's stories. It's easier to place labels on those who are different from us than to peel back the layers and understand what's really underneath. Wally Bryan was the former mayor of Hopkinsville, Kentucky, where I previously served in ministry. Poverty was one of the pressing issues in that community, and so while he was mayor, he made the decision to actually live in several of the impoverished neighborhoods in that community in order to be with the people and truly try to understand their needs and see how his position might help. Not long after we moved to Hopkinsville, I went on a bicycle ride with Wally one afternoon. It was a sort of tour of the other side of the tracks. As we began down Dirt Avenue, perhaps the poorest street in town, Wally pointed out the small apartment into which he first moved when he became mayor. He told me a story about his first month of living there. He said, every day I used to drive my truck home on the same route. As I'd approach my apartment, I always passed by a house outside of which stood an older gentleman in the front yard, always working. Every day, without hesitation, I'd drive past the man and kindly wave, but I never understood why the man didn't wave back. Finally, one afternoon, I was getting home. I drove by the neighbor and waved, but I noticed the man wasn't not only not waving, but he was mumbling something as I drove by. And so I stopped my truck, I backed up, and I got out, and I said to him, I'm sorry, were you trying to say something to me? My neighbor responded, you've been living in our neighborhood now for over a month. And every day you drive by and you wave, but not once have you stopped to ask us any of our names, or let alone think it was important enough to share with us yours. Well, he said, I was reminded in that moment, it's a lot easier to be friendly than it is to be in relationship. What I heard him say is, it's a lot easier to stay on the surface than it is to go deeper. And I can't help but wonder if that's the reason Jesus chooses fishermen as his disciples. As far as I can tell, at least a third of them come from this profession, some of whom we're reacquainted with in our reading this morning. Does Jesus prefer those who fish because their vocation requires them to know something about the depths? I don't know. What I do know is that fishing stories are always stories of prodigious surprise, of unlikely triumphs or amazing brushes with elusive glory. To fish is to depend on the unseen, to be blessed or cursed by what's hidden in the waters. Strange things happen. Sometimes the fish disappear, and sometimes the mysterious sea delivers up its bounty where none would have ever been expected. I mean, when 95% of the world's ocean and 99% of its ocean floors are unexplored, when you put out into deep water, you never know what you're going to get. Which I can't help but wonder is some of Simon's reservation in this passage today. Jesus tells Simon to put out into deeper water. But at first Simon says, Lord, we've been fishing all night and we've caught nothing. You see, Simon's a professional. He knows that in the Sea of Galilee you only fish in deep waters at night. And if you don't catch them then, you most certainly are not going to catch them in the morning. I imagine him saying something like, come on, Jesus, why don't we stay a little closer to the shore? I mean, we could at least catch some brim there. It'll be enough to survive. But of course, we all know Jesus isn't interested in survival. He's interested in new life. And so Jesus encourages Simon to put the nets out into deep waters despite his reservations. And all of a sudden they have more fish than they can even manage. So many their boats begin to sink. And Luke writes that these fishermen leave everything and follow Jesus. Frank Borman had a similar experience a little more recently. Frank was one of the 3 astronauts on the Apollo 8 mission in December 1968, which of course was the first ever mission to the moon. It was also the first time any human being had left the Earth's orbit. He's 90 years old today and was recently interviewed about his experience on This American Life. He talked about his motivation for the mission. It wasn't so much about space exploration as it was beating the Russians to the moon. He said, I was there because it was the Cold War. I wanted to participate in this American adventure of beating the Soviets. But along the journey, something else happened to Borman. As they plunged deeper and deeper into space, into depths never seen before by human eyes, they discovered a place that was, well, rather uninteresting. The moon was full of devastation, meteor craters, no colors at all, just shades of gray. Actually, the most interesting part of the experience for Borman was looking back and seeing the Earth rise up over the moon's horizon as they circled around. In fact, you've seen this picture before. It's called Earthrise Shot. It was taken by Borman's fellow crewmate, Bill Anders from Lunar Orbit. Borman said in that moment, I realized the dearest things in life were back on Earth. My family, my wife, my parents. I had to go deeper into space than any human being before to discover who I am and be reminded of what's really important to me. Borman retired from NASA soon after his return, despite having the chance to actually walk on the moon on a later Apollo mission. He turned down the opportunity and said he very, very rarely thinks about the mission these days. He's more interested in caring for his wife, who now has Alzheimer's. You see, the truth is, it's not easy to go deeper. But as people of faith, that's where we're called to go. Isn't that what Jesus teaches over and over again? You have to be the last to be the first. You have to lose to gain. You have to die to live. And it's not just what Jesus wants for us. We know we need it too. That's why we don't sing the hymn Shallow River. We sing the hymn Deep River. We don't sing about dipping our toes into the water. We sing about wading into the water. We disciples in particular don't talk about being sprinkled. We sing hymns about being fully immersed. I don't know, perhaps those outside the church have been right to a degree. Maybe the church today, Christianity in the 21st century, is a mile wide and 2 inches deep. That's what Bill Hybels discovered as pastor of Willow Creek Church, the first real mega church in this country. A few years into their ministry, they noticed their growth had peaked and they were slowly experiencing a decline. And people were filing in the front door, but they were leaving in droves out the back. And so they surveyed these people and they asked, "What are you looking for?" And the number one response on those surveys was, "We want to go deeper." And I'm pleased to say that there are churches doing this today. I have a colleague whose church has decided to take on the challenge of having a series of conversations about those partisan issues that divide us today. Once a month, they gather in the fellowship hall, and a trained facilitator leads them in civil dialogue. The idea is not to change anyone's minds, but rather to show the world that we can agree to disagree and still love one another. Don't get me wrong, the conversations have gotten heated. One conversation recently on immigration was particularly contentious. However, at the end of the evening, he noticed that the 2 individuals who'd been the most vocal in their disagreement on the issue were standing back at the coffee pot, talking very calmly with one another while folks gathered around them and listened. My colleague got a letter in the mail about a week later from one of those individuals, and it simply said this: "Thank you for our conversation last week. I made a new friend." And when they let down their nets, they caught so many fish their nets began to break. And they came and they filled up both boats. So they began to sink. Sandy Springs Christian Church, it's time for us to go deeper. The visioning process we're about to embark on this year is going to require us to dive in together. And I know that's a little scary. Some of you have been out fishing for a long time and you're tired. You've been through this process before, only to see the best laid plans struggle to even make it out of the boat. You're reluctant to jump in. I get it. But the only way this is going to work is if we dive in together, that we take time to deepen our relationships with God and one another, that we move beyond our personal preferences and start looking toward the greater good, that we not just say hello to that neighbor in the pew, but that we start to really get to know each other, that we have honest dialogue about who we are and who we're not, that we have hard conversations about what might be holding us back, that we invest in this community of faith in ways we maybe never have done so before. Attending worship faithfully, giving more generously, loving our neighbor unconditionally. I know we may not have developed this trust yet. I've only been here a year. I understand. But the only way we're going to find out is if we take the plunge. That's what I told Clara last summer. Before moving here, she had yet conjured up the courage to jump into the deep end of the pool. She'd sit on the side and put her legs in. She'd tiptoe around the edges and look down in the water. She even got up on the diving board a few times, but then got afraid and came back off. Finally, we told her, "Clara, if you'll just try it, We think you'll love it. I remember the moment it happened. We counted backward. 3, 2, 1. And she pinched her nose. She closed her eyes and she jumped into the pool, only a moment later to burst to the surface with a smile on her face. She said, "I'm doing that again." We spent the rest of the summer struggling to get Clara out of the deep end. So my friends, it's time. Let's suit up. Go get your goggles, your snorkel, your scuba gear, whatever you need. I don't know what we're going to discover along the way. All I know is that Jesus promises when we go deeper that we will experience new life. Are you ready? 3. We can do this. 2.